assembly action, you can declare a conflict of interest. So the S version makes some changes that I wanted to point out here and why we're doing it. The first one is instead of establishing an initial rate of levy in the charter amendment, it's changing it so that the Assembly, if this charter amendment is approved by the voters, it delegates authority to the Assembly to set the initial tax rate. Then I base that on what kind of projects or programs or funding is needed at the time when you develop an ordinance, and also the effective date. In talking with Treasury, we talked about July 1st, September 1st, and other dates. And it seemed more reasonable to, when an ordinance implementing this is passed, with how Treasury will administer it and so forth, to also set an effective date that works for the Treasury Division and how this will be used. So that takes this out of the charter amendment and delegates it to the Assembly to be added by ordinance. The next change here is in net receipts. We added net receipts in place of revenue for the dedicated revenue stream. And that's because we want this new tax to pay for itself first, pay for the administration of the collection and enforcement and audit from this new tax revenue instead of from other current money. So it would first pay for that cost of administration, and then only the net receipts left over, the dedicated revenue for these specific purposes set out here for public safety uses related to alcohol and drug consumption and use. Next, I have a change in the S1 version, and the S1 version makes changes in 3 places, but they're all the same. It's basically removing this phrase, and that's at the advice of bond counsel. It's a little redundant of the more broader umbrella phrase, payment of financing obligations. Issuing revenue bonds is a very particular type of bond, as it has some restrictions by the Alaska Constitution. It didn't make sense to include it here, so on advice of bond counsel, it's moved. And the ordinance title, also here on the proposition title, which you see on page, I think 2, or the bottom, page 1 of the ordinance. Another change here from the S version is the charter amendment language in subsection A. Mr. Trainee asked that the maximum allowable tax rate be increased to 10%, and it includes that request from 6 to 10. It also says whether an initial rate of levy, so we're not allowed to hit the alcohol industry huge 10% at once, limits the initial rate at 5%. Then you would see in subsection B there's controls and how that would work. It could only increase every 2 years, but only maximum every 2%. There's no limit on decreases anytime in any amount to the tax rate. So it doesn't hit the industry too hard at one time, maximum 5%. But the actual rate, initial rate, would be determined by the Assembly by ordinance. Again, probably as you consider how the revenue could be used, the amount you want to collect, the amount what you want to use it for, since it's dedicated. It also has the effective date being deleted from that part. So the next change in the S version from the original ordinance is this language again, like I mentioned on the titles, first allowing the revenue to pay for administration costs, administration, collection, and audit. And then only the net proceeds are dedicated, and the remaining phrase that's unchanged, providing for financing alcohol and or drug treatment rehabilitation programs, facilities, housing, and public safety. We've tried to make this scope for this particular need, but as broad as possible. Housing, cleaning up for campsites that are magnets of alcohol abuse, for example, and things like that. So another S version change on page 3 to the subsection D is language, again, recommended by our public financing division and bond counsel. It simply helps provide flexibility for using the revenue for financing options, to finance projects, capital improvements, and things like that. There's a whole number of structures. Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Please let me know if I need to clarify this. We've got that any time, okay? So bond counsel recommended this language to provide the flexibility for whatever financing structures and approaches are available to municipalities generally. we don't want the charter language to unintentionally limit how this dedicated tax revenue can be used. So this ensures that we can use it in a number of ways, which I'll describe a little later. And then in the S1 version, we have that first sentence that was in the S version, and bond counsel, as I described earlier, recommended removing it as unnecessary. It falls within the broader phrase that the second sentence already does. So we don't need to specifically mention revenue bonds in the charter language. It's covered by the broad language that says use it to support obligations incurred. Our next change in the S version is at the bottom of the slide here. The effective date, instead of it being July 1st when the tax would apply, it delegates that to the Assembly. So upon certification of the election, the charter will be amended. The Assembly will then get to act by ordinance, as seen in the other language, an ordinance to set the effective date for the tax. Now I've covered the changes made by the S version and the S1 version and to the language in our initial ordinance. We have a proposed amendment from Assembly members Constance and LaFrance. And this amendment here, you will see on Tuesday night, is to protect local businesses and producers of alcoholic beverages. It protects our local economy and right. So this language says wholesale sales of alcoholic beverages produced or manufactured by a bottler, brewer, group hub, winery, distiller, or manufacturer exempt from the tax. The way those terms are consistent with the license types in Title IV of the Alaska statute. They have certain license types for certain manufacturers who initially produce and bottle or package alcoholic beverages. So bottler, brewer, group hub, those all align with the state law license types that describe a producer or manufacturer, beer, wine, vodka, or so forth. So if they're within the municipality, this language protects that alcoholic beverage from the wholesaler's tax throughout the stream of distribution. So, for example, the way I see a brewery produces beer and bottles or cans it and then sends to a distribution warehouse. That transaction is exempt. The distribution warehouse in turn sends it to restaurants, stores, and so forth. That's also wholesale sales in the distribution stream. This language also protects that from the tax. So it would never apply throughout the distribution stream to a locally produced beverage. That's a floor amendment we'll see on Tuesday night. And as I understand it, yes, Mr. Constant.
So both
Good, Chris.
LaFrance and both Ms. LaFrance and I have heard some concerns from industry members that this may not be constitutional because of interstate commerce rules. And so I would love an opinion on that question.
We've been joined by Mr. Willington. Welcome, John. Can you get us an answer as to whether it's constitutional?
Yes, I believe this is constitutional. It's basically economic regulation. And I did a little research on this yesterday as well. So generally, local jurisdictions or taxing jurisdictions has plenary authority to grant exemptions from tax, and as long as it doesn't violate some other constitutional restrictions. For example, this is just based on where it protects the local economy, local businesses from this tax, and that's permissible. If we were trying to protect something and based on, businesses run by minorities or some other race, nationality, those kinds of prohibited bases for discriminating would be unconstitutional. This type of exemption is permissible.
So just a quick follow-up.
Okay, and then Mr. Dunbar.
The specific concern that I heard has been litigated in the past is the idea of a seasonal sales tax that targets out-of-state people, which is a different issue in some ways. But that's the concern that was brought up, so thank you.
Mr. Dunbar.
I think a seasonal sales tax is pretty clearly constitutional. I mean, I don't know how you target it specifically at just people from out of town, but I think that has been pretty well-settled law.
We had that solved a lot of years
Well,
ago.
but-
The seasonal adjusted sales tax is legal.
But regardless, I do think that the case that has been litigated where we lost was during the construction of the pipeline, when we tried to restrict it to just local employment and not add, and there was an equal protection argument. So I don't know if that's something they brought up, but that's something I am curious about. Is there an equal protection argument, Dean, or do you think that that is also settled?
I don't think so. That's a different situation. Since it's related, I think what you're speaking of is Privileges and Immunities Clause, which wouldn't allow, I guess, different treatment for employees out of state and employees in state. This isn't related to employment law at all, so I don't think you have the same application here. I will, though, do a little research on this and speak to it on Tuesday night to double check and perhaps
Thank you.
discuss with the municipal attorney and get you some brief answer then. Okay. My opinion at this time is this doesn't violate the Constitution, equal protection, or privileges, immunities, or otherwise.
Please continue, Dean.
All right. So that's the S version, S1 version, and proposed floor amendment changes to the original ordinance. And now I wrote an AM for the S version that talked about all the potential that this dedicated tax revenue stream could be used for. And it's somewhat of an advocacy effort to hopefully get 8 votes from the Assembly to put this to the voters and provide some platform for any campaigns in favor of this amendment. Since Mr. Trainee, of course, would like to see it passed and approved. So first I thought it was important to recognize what's the current funding for drug and alcohol treatment and substance abuse programs and services in the municipality. Most funding comes from federal and state and grants. The state fiscal situation, as we all know, is in flux, and they're really trying to deal with the fiscal crisis. So,
He needs to increase the volume, Dean.
The state fiscal situation, of course, causes some concern, but it's just important to recognize that the state has an alcohol excise tax in place that have language in statutes related to that tax that says this may be appropriated for drug and alcohol abuse and treatment and so forth, but it just may be appropriated. The state can't dedicate that revenue, and they're not allowed to by the Alaska Constitution and by the statute. So while the intent is there, it's not guaranteed that the state's alcohol tax revenue will be spent here in the municipality or even statewide. And of course that's a concern with the current situation. So alcohol and alcohol abuse and chronic inebriation, though it's a statewide problem, it somewhat concentrates here in Anchorage. As we see from some data from the Anchorage Safety Center, which often picks up chronic inebriates, transports them to the CBOP Center, and so forth. If you look at 2015 data, it shows that they served about over 3,000 people in 2015. Of those 3,000, 204 individuals caused 52% of the intakes at the CBOP Center. So it's a small segment of chronic inebriates that are generally causing most calls for service from the Anchorage Safety Patrol. Of those 204 individuals, the surveys show that only 36 of them are born in and from Anchorage. The rest are from around the state or out of state. So this generally just demonstrates it's a statewide problem, but it's here in Anchorage locally. So what can we do with this potential revenue to address it locally, bolster the efforts that are already in place, and perhaps serve as a fallback if state revenue funding doesn't come through? So one of the things with the 5%, 10% max, one of the things we can do is establish a rate that matches what you would like to do initially. This is approved this coming April. The potential for revenue is anywhere between 2.6 to 9 million. Now, the original ordinance said 2% for initial rate, and I think that the estimate was 1.6 million. So whatever you establish, this just gives you an idea of how much could actually be collected, and the data isn't really available to give a really completely reliable estimate which is why you see the broad range, with the $1 million difference between the low end and the high end. So what could be done with this type of revenue for these limited purposes that it's dedicated for? One thing to look at is the current positions that are in place. Some of them are funded by grants that won't last forever. And these positions are very successful. So I consulted with the homelessness coordinator, Nancy Burke, to talk about these. And so I asked her, well, if you had 1.6 million or more of revenue from dedicated alcohol tax, what could you do with it? And she said, these positions are probably the most significant in terms of addressing the alcohol abuse and chronic inebriate problem in Anchorage. The social services coordinator position, you might have seen in a news article a couple months ago, was very successful in finding, for some of the most problematic chronic inebriates and chronic homeless, finding the permanent housing and stable housing over time. Each position is about $70,000 annually, and that's not the salary, that includes the compensation and so forth. So easily 1.6 million revenue can easily provide one of these positions in that. So also important to that effort is a mental health clinician to plan the individual treatment programs, the placement, follow through, and so forth. So a mental health clinician, $140,000. Now they already have, I guess, one or two of those social service coordinators, mental health clinician. We can bolster those efforts though, because the need is really in excess of what we have in place now. If we have a few other positions, we can make a much greater impact, I think, on addressing chronic inebriation in Anchorage and homelessness as well. So we also have the Housing First program, and many of you are familiar with Carlick Manor. This Burke informed me that to operate that annually is about $600,000 for staffing to treat about 50 clients. And the Carlick Manor has been very successful. They have a 90% retention rate, which means long-term housing for the residents who live there. But it's at capacity, and of course, an additional Housing First program would be very beneficial. Dedicated alcohol tax could fund that $600,000 needed for a second Housing First project if one comes up for the municipality in the future. We're a growing city, but I think our problems will grow in the future as well. This dedicated alcohol tax can help us plan for addressing the growing problems if they continue. Now, I also wanted to talk a little bit about how the dedicated alcohol tax revenue could be used in rural programs support in some other contexts. One is a substance abuse disorders treatment, the residential treatment beds for alcohol and drug abuse. There was a draft study done recently. It covered Anchorage and Matsu that said there's 199 beds combined available at this time. But there's a demonstrated need for about 48 to 96 additional beds right now. The sad part, I think, about this is that there's 27 beds that are there that have the space, but they don't have the staffing support necessary to provide that residential alcohol treatment to them. So they have the space, but not the staffing. If we had the funding, then 27 beds could be used immediately. Yes, Mr. Constant.
This is getting
Chris.
very uncomfortable for me because those 27 beds are my employer, right? And so I am clearly still feeling conflicted at this moment.
Take a walk if you want, Chris.
This is
Okay?
We can
This
call
is
you
just
that.
a potential use of the money,
I
Chris.
understand, but boy,
Anyway, please continue, Dean.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Schwinn. So, as I was saying, there's 27 unfunded beds at this time. If we had revenue in place now, or if we had dedicated alcohol tax revenue, it could be used in various ways, but limited to alcohol drug treatment. These 27 beds might be in service. Now, in the future, as I mentioned, the city is growing. This draft study said projected population growth, and that includes our substance abuse, drug abuse population, alcohol abuse population. In the next 20 years, we would probably have a need for 127 additional beds by 2040. And how will we plan for that? Of course, funding is one component of planning for that type of service growth in the future. So this dedicated alcohol tax revenue could be one part of that extension.
Mr. Dyson's got a question. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I missed something, but when you say 27 unfunded beds, but doesn't that mean 270? Because each of the symbols, or my, all right, so you're showing it is just 27. And so the symbol up there in the right-hand corner, it says, yeah.
One shows funded and the other one shows unfunded color.
No, I got that.
variation.
All right, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, please.
The graphic, if it's a little off, I apologize, but the numbers I think are correct, at least from the draft study that we took that information from.
Please continue, Dean.
And again, you know, I'm the city council, I'm not an expert in these services, but Nancy Burke or some other experts in the administration could answer more specifically about information and accuracy. There's many other programs that could be supported by this alcohol tax revenue. Mrs. Burke informed me there's all these unmet needs. This revenue could be used for transitional housing. You mentioned assistance for temporary housing grants and so forth. I think the cleanups for camps that are magnets for alcohol abuse falls within the scope of this dedicated tax revenue, and as we've seen, it's been difficult to find funding for that purpose. Now, I am moving on to potential projects, and recently I talked about the programs that could be supported by the alcohol tax revenue. Projects are capital improvements, new structures and buildings and so forth. We often fund them by bonds. Now, we have right now a proposal that you've seen in our legislative program for rebuilding the Clitheroe Central and asking the state for funding for it. So those plans are already in place. And I want to be clear, this alcohol tax revenue isn't intended to interfere or get involved in that rebuilding plan right now. I mean, we can't expect this revenue until, I don't know, the end of next year or 2019. And I want to be clear, though, we're not trying to add it into the current project for rebuilding Clitheroe Center. But there is a vision that the Clitheroe Center could be more of a campus, though this whole land area surrounding Clitheroe Center has potential to support several other buildings. As we saw, there's projected need for an additional 127 treatment beds in the future. Well, the alcohol revenue could be used and leveraged to support construction of additional buildings on the Clitheroe campus. Now these ideas come from something that maybe some people in this room have seen before. There was a Raspberry Court proposal for some property we might have gotten from the federal government. We didn't get that land, so that proposal has gone through, well, that proposal got tabled. But some of the ideas could be applied to a Clitheroe campus, adding additional buildings to house 80 beds each. As we saw, 20 years in the future, we might have a need for that many treatment beds. And $35 million for each of those buildings, that's a significant expense. But that could be financed and by using this alcohol tax revenue to secure bonds to pay for the construction. And additionally, that vision had included other buildings for conferencing, administration, and maintenance needs for the whole campus. So that vision could become reality with funding like this from the alcohol tax revenue. But how could it happen? I know I'm not a financial expert, I'm an attorney, so we have, fortunately, experts that are disposal in the administration to ask how we can make it happen. We have some precedent as well. So bond council advised language for the charter amendment that would be flexible and allow things like this. And one is to establish a public corporation that its financing would be tax-exempt bonds and issues. We have a precedent in terms of the bed tax. There was a 4% increase in the bed tax, and it was dedicated tax as well. It was dedicated to construction of the convention center across the street. It was allowed to happen by, I think, a series of 3, 4, or 5 pieces of assembly legislation which established Civic Ventures as a nonprofit corporation, and its purpose is to construct the center and operate it, and it had the tax revenue to allow that to happen, and tax revenue and projected revenues from renting out the convention center and so forth. It could issue revenue bonds. I've mentioned revenue bonds several times, and I guess it's important to say why. General obligation bonds require voter approval in its municipalities. You need an election that we would get about once a year. Revenue bonds are a different type of bond, and they can be issued by the assembly or by a public corporation or a public enterprise. But there are restrictions on issuing revenue bonds. It can be secured only by the it's in the Constitution. It can only be secured by revenues of a public enterprise or corporation. So they've been able to work it out in a structure for the convention center. I don't see, and I've talked with bond counsel and our public finance and investments division, a similar structure. It's possible to establish one for some of the projects that I mentioned earlier, some of those $35 million buildings and so forth. Well, another approach is the public authority, a public enterprise. So much like the Anchorage Community Development Authority, they use the parking meter revenue as a revenue stream, and they build our parking structures and garages and things like that. Well, similarly, we could establish a social services and housing authority and contract with it to receive our dedicated alcohol tax revenue, all of it, some of it, whatever amount. There's some flexibility, that's what we could do. It could be designated or instructed to focus on drug alcohol treatment and manage facilities, construct the facilities with the revenue, issue revenue bonds for the construction, and so forth. Another structure that could be used and that falls under the flexibility of the charter language we're proposing is a leaseback structure. And we heard about this kind of structure recently with funding our police and fire retirement obligation, certificates of participation, and issuing those secured by tax revenue, the lease payments in the future secured by tax revenue could allow this type of structure to be in place. Now, if you have questions about financing options and how they would work, I could answer a few superficially, but our CFO or Ross Wisvold in public finance would be a better source for information.
You done?
Mr. Steele have a question?
Mr. Steele?
Well, when at the appropriate time.
If you're done, we can start taking questions, Dean.
Okay.
Are you done
Okay,
now, or you got another one? Fred?
I have some philosophical reservations about, quote, syntaxes. But if we're going to go down that road, it seems to me we ought to be focusing a bit on the problem causers, and the idea that, I support the idea of wanting to be good to our local manufacturers and so on, but once we start giving favoritism to somebody, it seems like we're missing a component. Now, this is only an old fisherman's evaluation, but my analysis is that liquor that's served with meals rarely causes problems. My guess is liquor that's served in our hotels, by definition, those folks are almost always not from Anchorage, so there's no downstream costs in general, for the hotel patrons. The last time I looked at all this, if you look at the maps, most of the problems seem to come from liquor stores that have a walk-up clientele, you know, and so on. So if we're going to show favoritism to one group, it seems to me to be consistent, we ought to consider exempting the hotel folks who there's no logic trail from their guests to our costs. But I would enjoy a legal comment on, are we getting out there in the area of equal protection or discrimination when we carve out one group to be exempt from this tax?
Okay, Mr. Dyson,
Question.
could I answer a question at the end?
Sure.
I understand it. One thing I would say right now, though, is this is a wholesale sales tax, so it wouldn't apply when somebody's ordering a drink at the hotel, restaurant, or bar. It would apply when a distributor sends, you know, their kegs or cans or boxes of wine bottles to the hotel. It would apply to that wholesale sales transaction. I will have to think a little more about how that is accepted for the hotels to make wholesale sales. I think that would be very awkward to try to develop that type of decision. But let me think about it. Anyways,
You get an answer. We've got some other questions, Dean. I've
Mine's-
got a list. Tim?
Yeah, mine's along the same line. I have a problem that we're identifying one industry to help with a number of issues, whether it be alcoholism, marijuana, or drug abuse, or you know, for a range of issues in terms of housing issues, and we're asking one segment to become people, and it seems to me that they can contribute to it, but I'm not sure that it should be. If we have the freedom to jack it up every couple of years, we're going to jack it up every couple of years, and it may or may not be consistent with the increased problem caused by that particular industry.
Well, that's the
And
same
so
option we
that's-
have on marijuana, Tim.
I-
We haven't done that yet. John?
I have a couple of questions. Well, are we done with the presentation or is there more?
Are we done with the presentation, Dean?
no, it's not, but it will be soon.
Let him finish and then we have half an hour left.
Do you have any in the queue?
I've got you in the queue
And
first.
I will address Mr. Steele's question as soon as I finish here. But I think it's important what both of you have said, and I do have an answer. But one question that we often get when we talk about new taxes is what's the effect on our tax cap? So I wanted to address that up front here. Our tax cap language has several subsections as to what's outside the tax cap. So a special tax authorized by voter-approved ballot issues, they're outside the tax cap when they're first approved. I think this alcohol tax, it would fall within that subsection, within that language. Since it's a dedicated tax revenue stream for certain purposes, it's in a way a special tax. Now, special tax isn't defined in the charter or actually in the Alaska statutes or anywhere. But if you look at case law and precedent, generally it usually means a tax adopted for a specific purpose, and that's a pretty much dedicated tax. Most of the time you see it as a special assessment. It's a tax for road improvements, you get special assessment tax, you know. But this also falls within the category of special tax. So it would be outside the tax cap when it's adopted. And then subsection C of Charter Section 1403 says after the first year, it's added to the tax base for the calculation of the tax cap the following year. So it would increase it just based on the revenues that were adopted. Now, after that, we have, of course, the flexibility for the Assembly to increase the tax rate. And what happens then with the tax cap? For example, we have an initial rate of 4%, and then 2 years later, the Assembly increases it to 2% to fund some project or program. And this language is intended to address that. It gives, in charter language, identifies any increase, such as the one I described, as outside the tax cap when it's first adopted, and then added to the base for the calculations of the tax cap, the tax limitation, the following year. Now, that's how I've structured it. So I think it's reasonable because we already have a limitation on how much the alcohol tax can increase. It can only increase by 2% if it's increased, and it can only increase every 2 years. So I think that that's enough protection without having the tax cap limitation on an increase of the alcohol tax in place as well. So that's my reasoning behind including this language in the chart. So I have a summary here of what the ordinance does. If the S1 version is approved by the Assembly, and we need 8 votes to send it to the voters. If they approve, we've got the 10% maximum rate, a 5% maximum initial rate, and when it's effective, decided by the Assembly by an ordinance. Then we have the increases, limitations that I just mentioned. There's no limit on decreasing the tax. If you're getting concerned about why we're increasing what it's for, I mean, there's no reason the Assembly couldn't decrease the tax. Increases outside the cap. Revenue first covers the costs of collecting and administering the tax, and then it receipts for the dedicated purposes described. Now, I think I wanted to respond to Mr. Steele's question, and one thing you're looking at is the potential uses of the revenue that I've shown you here in my presentation. But those are just some of them. There's a whole bunch. So, for example, this revenue could be used for alcohol campaign for youth and dangerous alcohol abuse, an education campaign. That's related to consumption of alcohol and alcohol abuse. It's not in my list here. So Mr. Traney, it's his proposal, and these are the things that he saw as ways it could be used. But we've got 10 other Assembly members who maybe have other ideas and what would be a more, I guess, a better or different principled way to use alcohol tax revenue, to educate or make, a position to support pregnant women and help them avoid, for example, alcohol use, drug abuse, provide them treatment, during their pregnancy. That's something that this could be used for. It falls within the scope of that language. This is dedicated for purposes of alcohol abuse treatment and services programs. So I've only mentioned some of the potential, and Mr. Steele, you have identified that there's more up there. Now, this is just one step. It's the first step. If we have the alcohol tax revenue in place, the Assembly still has an ordinance to pass, and you have, I guess, different programs you can think of how it could be used. You've got a budget process where this revenue could be appropriated for certain purposes. The restriction is just that it has to be used for purposes that fall within the dedication of the revenue that we've worded in this charter amendment.
Thank you, Dean. Would you hit the light, and then we'll get to the Assembly questions. Thank you, Barbara. Tim, you're first.
Simple questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
It just seems to me that we're saying that the alcohol industry, unless we're also taxing the marijuana industry, the mental health industry, to just have an alcohol tax as the only source there is not good. Are we going to put the marijuana revenue that we get into this kitty as well? Or how are we going to have a fairness issue to the various industries? Seems.
Well, you did approve taxing marijuana. Remember when you voted for that?
I know it, but
we do get money from marijuana,
and that's fine, and we're dealing with it for marijuana, and that's great. But can we also deal with it for mental health issues? Can we also use the money for?
I think we can,
for
Tim.
alcoholism.
It resides with this body, and
or
like
shouldn't
you
it
know.
go to the problems caused by that particular industry?
John?
A couple of things. I share Tim's thoughts on that too. One thing is, did you think about putting the tax on gallons like the state does? It seems like collecting it would be easier because we could get them to collect it. And it would, then it's an excise tax also, so the processing would be different.
Yes, we did, and we're not allowed to do that by state statute. So Title IV, regulating alcohol, it only allows municipalities to do certain things, and we can impose a sales tax. That's all. We can't impose other types of taxes. So our choices are wholesale sales tax or specific sales tax, retail sales.
Well, what's interesting is Fairbanks and Juneau both tax alcohol. They get approximately about $3 million each,
General sales tax as opposed to.
but it's on alcohol.
So do you want me to continue? Or?
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. You know, another thing I'm worried about is that I'm uncomfortable with is the vote threshold. And I know we've done this before, but when you drop it from the 60% for the sales tax to 50, in particular with something that is not one industry and that is outside the sales, the tax cap. You know, for 60%, I think it's in the spirit of our charter, but the 50% for that makes me nervous. I guess that's just a comment. But then regarding the tax cap, I understand that, but we also have a spending cap. And we've chosen to ignore that for 2 years, but I think that 2 years runs out very soon, like now. And how does this affect the spending cap?
You know, that's a good question.
Let's ask
I
our
haven't really
CFO.
considered how it would
That's
affect
the reason he's smiling, is over in the corner.
some- well, if the CFO can speak to it now, sure.
Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure that I have an answer to that. Let me get back with an answer on that. In this case, as I understand it, this would be, as proposed, money that would come in outside the cap. How the mechanism ties that back to the spending cap, I have to go about it.
Can you get us analysis on it, Robert,
Yes, sir.
by Tuesday? Appreciate it. Forrest?
Yeah, I have a question on the. First of all, I wanted to ask. I wasn't on the body yet. Did the marijuana? I'm trying to recall. Did the 5% tax on marijuana? So we already do tax marijuana. Was that a charter amendment that was 50+1, or was that a 60% threshold?
That was a 50% vote to amend the charter.
Okay, so we used charter amendment, put the marijuana industry tax on there. It is 5%. We've had a lot of rhetoric about treating alcohol and marijuana the same, so that seems equitable to me if they had a 5% tax as well. Although the thing that concerns me, and this is a broader top conversation that we haven't really had yet, is that we know that a lot of the people who are in our facilities now for drug addiction got there because of opiates and are now addicted to heroin. And obviously we can't tax heroin because it's illegal, but a serious public discussion about opiates and the you know, it's not alcohol. I don't want to have the whole conversation about this, but it's a small percentage of people who consume alcohol that become problematic. It's a relatively small percentage of people that consume opiates that become problematic, and yet we treat these things completely differently, and I think that's sort of interesting. We haven't had that real public discussion about opiates and whether or not those should be taxed in some way. But anyway, for my specific question for you, Dean, regarding the amendment that will exempt craft breweries or locally distilled or brewed alcoholic beverages, will that be structured in a way that, what about craft breweries and distilleries that are outside the municipality of Anchorage? So, you know, Hoodoo Brewery or the distillery in the Valley, when those come into Anchorage, will those products be subject to the same tax?
Yes, I believe they would.
So it would be exemption for local craft breweries.
Yes, that's how it's written. If it's produced within municipal boundaries.
But and that doesn't cut either way for me, actually. I mean, that's, you know, Anchorage has absorbs a lot of the problems from the rest of the state, as we know, and so it's up to us to look out for the interest of Anchorage and businesses in Anchorage. But I just want to be clear about what we're doing.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also had questions about the 50% plus one. So thank you, Mr. Dunbar, bringing up that example from the marijuana tax. One question concerning appropriations. How do we ensure that the money or the net receipts would be used towards drug and alcohol treatment programs? Or how could we guarantee that this revenue would not go into the general fund?
The chief fiscal officer can help us with that because they track where the money comes in and how much money. For example, yesterday we had that meeting. Remember when I asked him exactly how much money came in from tobacco? He said $23 million. So at any given time, we can find out exactly where the money's coming from and what it's going to. Chief fiscal officer can do that. That's that great SAP program we've got now.
Can I ask a follow-on question to hers before we?
We got about 10 minutes left.
Just to clarify that though, imagine that so this will be in the charter, so it says you have to spend this on alcohol treatment or drug treatment. If a future assembly decides, no, we're going to spend it on snow removal, who has standing to bring a lawsuit to stop us?
Any citizen?
Is that right?
I think any citizen covered by the charter would have the ability to come in.
Okay.
Taxpayer standing.
Suzanne, I'm sorry.
So, and just follow up, it's the language in the subject, that second part, especially to allow use of the net receipts to support programs and projects in the municipality, including the payment of financing obligations, et cetera. This is all under that rubric, though, of drug and alcohol treatment programs. I mean, the language sounds.
What it's dealing with is the cost of running the program. I mean, we've got to pay for the cost of this
Right.
program. That's where the cost is going to be at.
Okay,
And according to Chief Fiscal Officer, I think you guys told us you didn't need to hire that many employees because you can collect at the wholesale level a lot cheaper than do at the retail level.
Chair, that's correct. The wholesale tax is fairly easy for us to administer. I don't have the exact figures on this staffing, but it's going to be very minimal compared to a retail tax that affected a number of vendors around
Right.
around the city where we've had to collect information from a number of people.
okay, but this specific statement, this language here only pertains to drug and alcohol related programs, not general.
We'll have to take a look into that.
I'm sorry, when you make sure I'm looking at the language you're pointing out, is that subsection C?
No, just
What
in the
page?
subject
Oh,
in the
in
very
title.
front.
Okay.
Instead of reading the title, I recommend we read the actual
Okay.
charter language.
Okay.
But it's similar there. If you see on page 2 at the bottom, see dedicated to providing for financing alcohol and or drug treatment or rehabilitation programs, I guess would include staffing and services and so forth. Facilities, including housing, construction, and capital projects, and public safety purposes related to primary, secondary effects of alcohol or drug abuse. I recognize, the concern, like Mr. Wilton and you are expressing about having and drug treatment or and drug. It's possible, there's a philosophical, I guess, perception here that why should we use alcohol tax revenue for drug treatment like opiates? I mean, it's up to assembly members if you think that should be amended to cross out and drug. Maybe it should just be for alcohol. We leave that to you. This is how it's drafted currently. Often alcohol and drug abuse go hand in hand, and they're often serving the same population.
And that wasn't so much my concern, is just making sure the language supported that use for drug and alcohol treatment, but it sounds like it does later on. Thank you.
Fred?
Yes, I believe it does.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, back to the subject of taxing the problem causers, my guess is the population that is causing the problems doesn't pay premium prices for their booze. So, I suspect some other jurisdictions have said, no, you can't sell shooters, or you can't sell wine that's less than $5 a gallon, or vodka, or whatever. And the only real question is that legal or constitutional, and have other jurisdictions used that approach? And I would guess that it should be applied only to package stores.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
put myself in the queue, please.
Okay. We'll have to get you an answer to that, Fred.
Thank you.
Felix?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 2 questions. So first, we've had a lot of rhetoric about treating marijuana like alcohol and vice versa. I'm just curious, when we talk about the potential increase every 2 years and how that would not be included within the tax cap, or we'd have to do a recalculation, however it works. Is that similar for marijuana, or are we creating a discrepancy?
Right now, the marijuana charter amendment, it has the marijuana tax revenue outside the tax cap until the year 2022, I believe. And that's in 1403. I might be able to pull it up. Do you remember, Mr. Harris?
Yes, I believe it slips back into the tax cap sooner than that. I think it might be 2019 or 2020. It's fairly soon where the revenues from come back. I can find out.
Felix?
Thank you.
Oh,
Anything else?
And then, yeah.
can I add a little bit to that part? Someone mentioned the marijuana tax revenue and how it's used. And the alcohol tax proposed here is dedicated to purposes the marijuana tax isn't. So that's one distinction, and why the marijuana tax revenue may not used for programs and so forth. I'm not sure where it goes, but there's no restriction on marijuana tax revenue.
Thank you. And then my second question actually falls along similar lines to Ms. LaFrance's. So in page 204 in that C definition, what actually caught my attention was lines 42 and 43 talking about public safety services related to detrimental primary and secondary effects of alcohol. My concern is that this definition might be too broad. Future assemblies might decide to interpret this in other ways and use it in the way that it shouldn't. So I don't know if this definition needs to be played around with more, or maybe my concern is already handled in another way. I want to make sure that this is being used for the purpose set out and the voters will be voting on, potentially.
Well, you could amend something into this charter language. You also have the option of clarifying the term means by an ordinance adopted by the Assembly to implement the provision. You could narrow what the promulgatory effects means in an ordinance. Of course, the future assemblies could amend the ordinance by an ordinance.
You can bind future assemblies.
So I guess it's really up to you as to where you want it, by voter approval or by assembly approval.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And for assembly members, you've got a list here of tax changes. Please read it. The federal government's reducing all the federal tax on alcohol in the United States. This takes effect, most of them in 2019. Chris, you got a question?
Yeah, I've got kind of a short slate. A quick question, Dean. Section 1406 of the charter, when I looked up the ordinance authorizing the marijuana tax rate, it said 5% plus increased as allowed under section 1406. What is that? What's the incremental allowance for increase?
It was 2%. Up to 2% yearly if we decide to do it every couple of years.
Without a ceiling?
Every 2 years.
I don't know what the ceiling was. We'd have to look. I can't remember what the ceiling was on it.
I need to pull it up. I think there was an maximum as well. 12%, I think it was.
Okay. So then any concern
Mr. Harris is
that
nodding, so that
any
must be
concern
right.
that we aren't treating alcohol like marijuana, I think then would argue that we should possibly increase the ceiling to 12% if we're talking about equity. And so I don't know that we want to talk about equity, but the marijuana people probably would agree with that. Second,
I know, John. I'll get to you
in,
next.
in terms of opiates and alcohol, the primary issue that treatment providers across the state have seen for decades and decades and decades and will continue for decades in the future is alcohol. Even though opiates are very at a peak right now, alcohol is at the core of this problem for generations. Then in terms of what we call it, the term of art in the field is substance use disorder services, but I think that doesn't communicate very well to the voter when you say drug and alcohol treatment. That's more, they get it. And then I agree, public safety purposes could then be, we could offset costs of APD with these dollars, and then we would see no net gain. And then finally, I have to declare a scenario that has occurred that it's not a conflict, but I want it on the record. back before this was introduced, on October the 8th, it's generally the season when fine bourbons are released into the market right at the beginning of November. And so for years I've been trying to get a bottle here and not have to travel to Kentucky to get a bottle. And so, but all the local retail outlets told me we don't get that here. And so I contacted the distiller and asked him, hey, how do I get this shipped up here? He said, oh no, we do. He said, contact this company. And so I did. I reached out to one of the distributors, and that was on 10/8 of 2017. And through various strings of communications, by 10/9, one of the distributors said, I'll contact one of the package stores to see if we can get you a bottle. The package store, to their credit, said, wait, an elected official asking for a special privilege? Hell no. And there was no special privilege being asked for. I just asked, where do I find one of these bottles? And finally, on 10/13, the conversation ended with me not getting a bottle from them. I had to find an out-of-state source. So then the media reported on 11/1, which was approximately 2.5 weeks later, that this tax was proposed. And finally, it was introduced on 11/8. So I want the record clearly reflecting that I engaged in that conversation before there was ever any public knowledge of this bill being introduced, so that when a media campaign down the road comes out, yeah, I don't appear to be like I was trying to abuse my office.
So what type of bourbon do you like?
Good ones.
Seems like a
What is that?
stretch.
No, I
Turkey
know,
or
but-
something?
But the tactics that I've seen by the advocates against this issue I have had some nasty calls, and I could just see that conflict being used against me, or that appearance of conflict. And so I want to clearly on the record state in front, sunshine on it, so that it can't come back.
Thank you, Chris.
I would like a promise from the industry they only attack Dick. That's it.
Yeah.
They can tax me. I have no problem.
It's all
with
Dick's
it.
fault.
Yeah, my fault. Yes, John.
Okay, just a couple quick notes. One is we can't compare the percent tax marijuana and alcohol, because the alcohol is on the wholesale price, and the marijuana is on the retail. There's a huge difference. And then just a question for Robert: when you're investigating the marijuana tax, at some point it goes under the tax cap. Does it increase the tax cap by that increment, or does it replace property taxes?
I think it displaces property.
That was my understanding. So that's very different from what's proposed here, where when the alcohol tax goes under the cap, it would increase the cap by that amount as well.
Yeah, but I think, part of the, if I might, Mr. Chairman, part
Go
of the
ahead, Chair.
model that was, I think, was used here was similar to what we used for the denier, where we had a specific revenue source used for a specific purpose to benefit the community. So that was, I don't know if you were, for example, trying to use this revenue stream for the next 20 years or so, 30 years to build a facility, that you'd want then to move that money out of that sort of dedicated revenue stream to be able to finance these projects.
No, I understand, but we've had some discussion here. Should marijuana and alcohol taxes have some equity there? And that's very different.
Well, thank you for your questions. We're going to debate this on Tuesday, and if we don't finish on Tuesday, I do have an assembly meeting set up for Thursday. Just to let you know, we've got two things that I see getting a lot of people out. One is MLMP potential sale. The other one is this item. So I anticipate we'll get lots of testimony.
Septic system?
What? No, but did you guys watch the State of the State last night?
Yes.
I cannot count, you cannot count on the state being able to deal with this issue on this local level. If we don't take care of ourselves, there will be nobody taking care of
That's
Anchorage.
exactly right.
This meeting's over with.
If you have floor amendments you want to propose, just contact my office.